Welcome to Tracking Moments of Truth. If you work in the front lines in the restoration industry, restoring your customers' homes and businesses, well, I promise you, you're going to love the concepts. Now, if you haven't listened to the two preceding messages in this series yet, the ones that are found on understanding your restoration client and building restoration relationships, please stop and go back and listen to those. And the reason why is that if you've absorbed the concepts, it's going to make a lot more sense to you. I know you want to get to the nitty-gritty, the details of working in your customer's home, but please go back and review this information first. Now, we've already covered a lot on this subject of making our job easier by improving our relationship with our customer. In our first message entitled Understanding Your Restoration Client, we examined the emotional dynamics of a customer. Do you remember the feelings that we encountered, the emotions? Bruised, battered, traumatized, devastated. We learned to anticipate how the customer is going to initially view us when we first walk onto the job. And how are they going to look at us? Well, they're going to look at us with suspicion, apprehension, worry. Maybe they're going to be a little hostile, and always they're going to be deep down scared to death as we walk through their door for the first time. Now, you know that old saying, forewarned is forearmed. And now you've been warned. And isn't it nice? Isn't it nice to know and understand the feelings of our customers? Because if we do that, we're going to be better able to work with them. Now, we also learned that no matter what our actual position is in our company, customer service is our number one job. Because when the customer sees us working in their home, to the customer, we are the company. And if the customer gets a bad opinion of us, it translates into a bad opinion of our company and a bad opinion of the job that we're doing for them. And that's a heavy responsibility on our shoulders. And here, all you thought you had to do was just scrub smoke or extract water. Now, we'd also talked about how customers form those all-important opinions. And they do that through moments of truth. And you recall that a moment of truth is any time a customer comes into contact with your company and forms an opinion. So they might see us working in their home, or they might hear our advertising on the radio, or maybe they hear a neighbor express an opinion about our company, or maybe they watch us track mud into their house. So we see that moments of truth can be either positive or negative. Now, how do we create those positive moments of truth in the customer's mind? With that important concept that I call answering the customer's unspoken questions with unspoken answers. You see, our customers are always observing us, and they're mentally asking things like, does this guy know what he's doing? Or, is she going to be an honest person working in my house? And we identified in our previous messages that the best way to answer these silent, mental questions from the customer, well, we reply with an unspoken, silent answer through the 3 A's. Do you remember what the triple A's are? Our appearance, our attitude, and our actions. So the silent, unspoken answers that we send to the customer create moments of truth in her mind. But that's enough theory now. Let's get down and dirty. Let's get specific on actual things that we can do in the customer's home to improve our relationship. In this message, we're going to be tracking these elusive moments of truth through a typical restoration loss. I'm going to use an example of a water-damaged home, but the principles and the customer's procedures that we're going to talk about, they'll apply no matter what type of damage that you're dealing with. Every time that we create one of these elusive moments of truth, you'll hear this sound. See if you can anticipate when one is going to happen and beat it to the punch. We'll start our story with our arrival at work. We're on time, and we're looking forward to our day. Our uniform is clean and pressed. Our shoes are shined. Our business cards are in our pocket. So our personal attitude and our appearance is perfectly primed to send a positive, silent message to our restoration client. The phone rings in the office. A frazzled, frantic customer's on the line. We're going to call her Ruth Wilson. But to us, her frontline technicians, she's always Mrs. Wilson until she invites us to call her by her first name. Mrs. Wilson's supply line in her kitchen sink separated last night and flooded most of her home with water while she slept. When she awoke, she sleepily swung her legs out of bed and plopped them into 3 inches of ice-cold water. What a way to wake up! Mrs. Wilson's voice is still quivering from the shock of it. The plumber has turned off the water, and her insurance agent told her to call your office. Yes, that's right. That's a huge moment of truth for your company, getting a referral from a person in a position of trust, like an insurance agent or an insurance adjuster. And to be brutally honest about it, insurance agents and adjusters are probably responsible for 90% of the insurance restoration work that you do, which likely means they're responsible for 100% of your salary. So always, it's quite obvious here, always present a proper picture to insurance company representatives and be real nice to them. Now, it's outside the scope of this message, but just let me say here that Mrs. Wilson's moments of truth started long before she sets eyes on you and even before this disaster happened to her. If your company has been in business for more than a few months, likely she's had contacts with your company before. And each one of these impressions would have been a small moment of truth. For example, your company advertising, your reputation, your company's trucks driving around town, even the manner in which those trucks are driven, all create little moments of truth. Now, if Mrs. Wilson's friends have used your services, or if someone else has, or if they know someone who has, their opinions will have lodged in Mrs. Wilson's mind and made moments of truth either good or bad. But let's get back to Mrs. Wilson's problem here. And it is a big, big concern. Maybe you're saying, "Nah, Steve, it's no problem. We've got truck mounts that'll suck your pants off. No big deal. We'll get her pumped out." But wait a minute. This is a big, big problem. Why? Because Mrs. Wilson thinks it's a big problem. You see, this is the worst thing, the biggest disaster that's happened in her life since she forgot to set the emergency brake on her new 63 Chevy when she went in for her weekly hair appointment. What a mess that made. And that was 30 years ago. So with our new insight that we have gained on looking through the eyes of our customer, we see that we're dealing with trauma of a major magnitude here. It's a big, big problem because your customer thinks it is. I've used the term frontline technician sprinkled throughout this course, and I've always used it to mean the employees who go into the customers' homes and perform the actual work needed to restore them from smoke and fire and water damage. But you know, you've got someone else in your company serving with you on the front lines. In fact, they're right out there in the most exposed position. And that's the individual who answers your phone. Talk about tough, and just like Rodney Dangerfield, these people get very little respect. So be nice to them. Buy them flowers on their anniversary. Say thank you once in a while. And please quit yelling at your phone personnel when things aren't going well for you out in the field. Besides, your phone people and your dispatchers are absolutely essential in building moments of truth with your restoration customers. I call this preconditioning the customer. Well, what do I mean by that? Well, if you precondition a rug, what happens to the stains? Well, they get all softened up and easy to work with. And it's the same thing with our customers. A preconditioned customer is already expecting you, the technician, to do a great job before you ever walk up and knock on their door. A properly preconditioned customer is just a joy to work with. All the previous moments of truth before you meet them help to precondition the customer, but how a customer's initial phone call is handled, it's a big, big moment of truth. Telephone procedures are really outside the scope of this entire course, but let's spend a few moments on the typical moments of truth that your customer is going to encounter over the phone. You see, when Mrs. Wilson dials your company's number, a whole sequence of moments of truth happen real fast. For example, the tone of the receptionist's voice, her willingness to listen, her ability to show concern for the trauma that Mrs. Wilson has endured. All of these qualities help create positive moments of truth in Mrs. Wilson's mind, and they give us, as frontline technicians, important clues on how we should deal and act with the customer. Your company's phone person will not just listen, but also quickly and professionally get the information from Mrs. Wilson that you need to respond. Mrs. Wilson is comforted by this calm, assured manner because of the silent message it sends. And that message is, "Hey, we've done this before. We can take care of you." Likely your office is going to have a list of suggestions to review with Mrs. Wilson on things she can be doing while you're on your way to the loss. What's the silent message? We're not just rug suckers here. Instead, Mrs. Wilson, we're a valuable consulting resource for you in this terrible, terrible time in your life. In fact, Mrs. Wilson, we're here to help you even before our employees come to your home. Well, what's the result? Mrs. Wilson heaves this big mental sigh of relief. She's pathetically grateful, and you have a preconditioned customer waiting for you at her home. Everybody wins here, even Mrs. Wilson, as long as we continue to create these positive moments of truth in her home. Now, especially with water damages, the need for immediate response is critical. Now remember here, Mrs. Wilson has cold water 3 inches deep throughout much of her home. Mrs. Wilson doesn't want to see someone tomorrow. Mrs. Wilson doesn't want to see someone next week. This is an emergency. Mrs. Wilson wants someone right now. So our immediate response is a great, fantastic moment of truth. And to a greater or lesser degree, this is true on any type of restoration loss. But on the other hand here, don't let the need for an immediate response cause you to go off half-cocked. Check with the office on any special equipment you need, any extra help, or subcontractors that should be notified. The silent message that we want to send to Mrs. Wilson is that of a massive, efficient, well-oiled machine swinging into action on her behalf. If we show up at her home and then we loudly moan, "Oh no, I forgot my vacuum hose," well, what message are we sending here? You're right, a poorly organized, incompetent, flaky company that can't be trusted, and an organization that Mrs. Wilson is really going to have to watch. Now, let's be honest here. Even the very best companies screw up. Instructions are missed, equipment's forgotten, sometimes things break down. But why let your customer know about it? All that's going to do is introduce a negative moment of truth into her mind. So if you've got a problem out on the job site, if you're frustrated, if you're mad, don't call back to the office and explode on the phone in front of your customer. Be discreet. Use code words if you have to. but convey an attitude of competent calm to your customer, that everything on this job is proceeding just fine. Then when you get back to your office, then you can blow up. Actually, I'm just kidding here. It's always non-productive in business to resort to anger and temper tantrums. But I guarantee you this, it's always downright tacky to do so in front of your customer. Let me make a suggestion to you here. Think about using and implementing in your company an equipment checklist on your fire and water damage initial response calls. It's a real negative moment of truth for the customer when you have to say, "Do you mind, Mrs. Wilson, if I borrow a screwdriver from you?" And believe me, it's a real negative moment of truth for you when your boss learns that you're 30 miles from the shop and you've left your toolbox behind. So now you're on your way to Mrs. Wilson's water-damaged home with all of your tools and your equipment. Mrs. Wilson has been preconditioned by the calm, efficient, and caring attitude of your phone personnel. Now, did you hear that word, attitude? So far in our experience with Mrs. Wilson, she has had a calm, efficient, caring attitude from our company. So what's that mean? She's been preconditioned. So what's her expectation going to be for us, her frontline service technicians? That's right. She's going to expect us to be calm, efficient, and caring. So as we drive to her house, it's time to have an attitude readjustment. Yes, I know, you wanted to be home early for a nice warm dinner, or maybe there's a party that's going to start without you. You know, these darn water damages never come in when we're all sitting around the shop saying, "I sure am bored. I wish somebody would call us with a water damage." It doesn't work that way. But since we have to spend the time here with Mrs. Wilson, we have to do this job either way. Why not have a good attitude about it? And if you think you're being inconvenienced, think about Mrs. Wilson. So as we've already learned, a cheerful, positive attitude creates lots of good answers for our customers' unspoken questions. Also, as we drive, try to remember to check on one of our other triple A's, our appearance. So let's try to tidy up. Nothing fancy. Comb our hair, tuck in our shirt, maybe chew on a breath mint. All of these things can either be positive or negative moments of truth, depending upon our appearance. But we're pulling up in front of Mrs. Wilson's home now. The moments of truth are going to come fast and furious. Remember that as soon as your truck comes into view of the customer's home, that's when our moments of truth begin. A good mental rule for all of us is to always act like the customer is watching, because the chances are good they are. So when you park, be careful not to block other cars. In fact, it's usually good to park out on the street, meet the customer, and scope the job first. Then, if you need to pull your truck closer and park in the driveway, you can ask Mrs. Wilson's permission. Think about that. What a wonderful moment of truth for any customer. And here's a big, big moment of truth anytime you're dealing with a fire or water damage customer. Once you're at the job site, once you've parked, get out of the truck promptly. Remember, we're supposed to be conveying a sense of urgency. And while you're at it, as you walk up to the door, don't cut across Mrs. Wilson's grass or flowers, and don't kick her dog. Okay, I'm just kidding here, but you get the point. Now, after you knock on the door or ring the bell, be sure to step back 3 feet. And what's that going to do? Well, that will give Mrs. Wilson some space when she opens her door. Now, if you have other employees with you, have them step back down a step too. Everybody also should have ditched their sunglasses by now. Why? Because we need to look into our customers' eyes, and you can't do that with your shades on. So now the door opens. We stand tall, look our customer in the eye, smile, and introduce ourselves and our coworkers. You say, everybody does all that, Steve. Well, I say to you, don't be so sure. In fact, if you'll create those 5 little moments of truth with your customer in the first few seconds, you're already far, far ahead of most of the restoration technicians in America today. And you know, it's such a simple sequence. Number 1, stand erect and straight. Number 2, look the customer in the eye. Number 3, smile. Number 4, introduce yourself. And number 5, introduce your fellow employees. Less than 15 seconds, 5 powerful moments of truth. Now maybe you've heard that expression, first impressions create lasting opinions. And this is so true with our restoration customers. You see, the shock and the trauma of this whole ordeal has made them very, very sensitive to the first impression that you send them. Now, I'll agree with you. You can get off on the wrong foot and then catch up later. But you know, that's a tough way to live. It's just a lot harder if we get off on the wrong foot with our customers. So let's look a little closer at these 5 doorstep moments of truth and really learn how to make positive first impressions. Number 1, stand tall. Well, what do we mean by that? Our body language sends a powerful, silent message at any time, but especially so when you've met an emotionally distraught customer that's trying to decide if she should trust her damaged possessions to our tender care. So if we're slouching, or if we have our hands in our pockets, or even, heaven forbid, we're leaning against a wall, well, what attitude does that convey to our customer? Certainly not the respectful, concerned, helpful attitude that we want to send. So when that door opens, stand tall, stand straight and erect. And then what do? Well, number 2, we look the customer in the eye. Well, what do you mean by that? What's the matter whether I look at their shoes, their belt, or their pet dachshund? I'm there to suck out a whole bunch of water, not to let them peer into my baby blues. Well, is that the way someone might feel? Well, it's true, but remember that this whole program is to structure your work around the mental comfort of your customer. And most customers today subconsciously think that if you don't meet their eye, well, then you're untrustworthy, you're nervous, or you've got some sort of big secret. So look your customer in the eye. That way you're going to get started off on the right foot, and maybe you'll learn something about their mental state if you look them in their eyes. Now, our third point is always smile at the customer. You know, it's always been a fascinating subject to me how many technicians act like the more they smile, the sooner they'll die. It's like these technicians feel like they're only allotted so many smiles during their life, and when they've used up their ration, they're going to pass away at an early age. So what happens? They parcel out their smiles very grudgingly to the customer. I don't know. Maybe it's some sort of macho thing. You know, like, I don't like this job. It's just temporary while I go to night school to learn brain surgery. And if I smile at you, the customer, well, you might think that I enjoy this job. Well, give me a break. Nobody says you have to do this type of work the rest of your life. But while you're doing it, and especially as you're standing in Mrs. Wilson's doorway, show some pride. Show pride in yourself, your company, and your profession. So smile at your customer. It won't hurt you. Now, our fourth doorstep moment of truth is to always introduce yourself. I'm continually amazed at the number of technicians who either won't or don't introduce themselves. They'll knock on the customer's door, and then they look at their shoes and mumble, I'm here to suck out the water. Now, I'm not saying here that every single business transaction requires an introduction. In fact, at times when a waiter or waitress engages me in a lengthy introduction, I'm always tempted to say, "Who cares who you are? Just bring me a corned beef on rye and some iced tea." But wait a minute here. You're not going to spend 30 seconds here with Mrs. Wilson just serving her lunch. You're asking to come into her home. You're going to be spending hours here, maybe even days. This isn't like buying a few groceries from a checkout clerk. So we should always introduce ourselves to our restoration customers. Now, since this is so important, this idea of the introduction and the first impression, let me share a few introduction tips with you. First of all, when you introduce yourself, use your first and last name. It's just more professional. And speaking of names, a lot of restoration employees ask me if they should call their customer by the first name or by their last name. Now, that's really a decision for your company management to make. A lot depends on where you're located, the type of customers, and the market that you serve. Some areas are just more informal than others. But I will say to you that you can't go wrong showing respect and courtesy to any customer. If your customer wants to have a less formal relationship with you, they can always say, "Please, just call me Ruth." And see, this is a lot better than them thinking, "This young fellow sure is being familiar with me." But the final decision on how to address your customers is up to your management, so check with them. Another question that I often run into is, well, should I shake hands with the customer? In most parts of the country, I'd say, yes, that's a good way to start your first impressions. But again, talk with your boss on this and then make a decision. Now, finally, our fifth doorstep moment of truth is introduce your coworkers. Coworkers? Who cares about them? They're just my dirtbag helpers. I'm the guy who talks to the customer. My point exactly. Maybe you've never thought about this before, but the relationship that we have with our fellow employees sends a big, big unspoken message to our customers. It's a huge moment of truth. Now, if you doubt me on this, let me illustrate it with an actual written comment I received from a fire restoration customer after my company was done with her home.
We wanted to tell you how much we enjoyed having your crew, Lori, Rebecca, Denise, and Chad, in our home. As I sat at my desk working, I could hear them visiting and bantering back and forth as they worked. It made me feel warm inside. They enjoyed each other and their work, and it made for a very comfortable feeling. They are good people.
You tell me. Did these employees send a forceful, silent message to this restoration client by their attitude and their manners toward each other? I certainly think so. Now, I stress building a relationship with your customer in this course. It's absolutely essential. But our goal is not just to get the customer to like us personally, but to build her trust and confidence in our entire company. Do you remember how we said we wanted to give the customer the impression of a large, well-oiled machine springing into action on her behalf? Well, one way we do this is by introducing everyone who comes into her home, along with a brief description of what they're going to be doing. For example, "Mrs. Wilson, this is Joe Green. He'll be helping me today." Or, "Mrs. Wilson, I'd like you to meet Sally Jones. She's our contents coordinator, and she's going to be helping with any of your personal property that got wet." Do you see how nice that was? So introduce everybody that will be helping in your customer's home. Use their first and their last names along with explaining their role in the restoration of Mrs. Wilson's home. Now, as we're going to see, your customer is already bewildered, and these introductions, while they may take a few extra seconds, they show your client respect, and they let her feel a little bit more in charge of her own home. You see, Don't ever crunch your customers' feelings just because you're trying to be more efficient. Now, do you see the beauty of what we're doing? Mrs. Wilson has had a devastating experience in her life. She's called us for help. Now, I know she thinks she's called us just to dry out and pump out her home, but it's a lot bigger than that. In the customer service field, we have a saying, fix the customer first, then fix the problem. Now, another good saying might be, pay me now or pay me later. Now, Mrs. Wilson's problem is a flooded home. But if we shove her out of the way and we blow into her house and we start sucking out her water, well, we're going to pay later. So our first priority is to fix Mrs. Wilson's battered feelings and bruised emotions. And when you think about it, almost all of our restoration clients will have these same negative emotions. So what we're talking about in this message is a consistent system to fix our customers' feelings. Now, as technicians, we don't control this entire customer care system. But still, it's important to be aware of it, to understand it, and to know how to play our part in our customer care system. It's real important to us because if the system's working right, the system will give us happy, preconditioned customers that are a lot easier to work for. And then we need to make sure that we pass on a preconditioned, happy customer to the next interaction with our company. So let's review what we've talked about in this message. Customers base their decisions on our quality of work. Well, they do it with moments of truth. And these are little fleeting impressions that they receive about our company. Many of these moments of truth are subconscious. The customer isn't even aware that they've happened in their mind. And these moments of truth add up in our customers' minds till an opinion pops out, fully formed in their conscious mind. Now, it would help us if the customer says, I wonder where that came from. But they don't do that. They just go with the opinion they have. So our challenge here is to bank up positive moments of truth in our customers' minds. A lot of these moments of truth occur even long before we meet the customer. For example, our company's ads and image-building campaigns, our company trucks with their logos all over the city, our company's reputation. All of these things create thousands of moments of truth every day in our customers and our prospective customers' minds. Insurance agents and adjusters, well, they're responsible for a huge moment of truth when they recommend that a homeowner call our company. So what's that mean? We always want to be extra considerate of the insurance company representatives when they visit the job. And then our customer care system continues when a customer calls our office. A prospective client with a damaged home is mentally asking all sorts of unspoken questions as they talk with our phone personnel. Do these people know what they're doing? Can I trust them? So your company's office staff will answer these unspoken questions with unspoken answers. And in the process, they'll be preconditioning a customer for you. But they'll also be setting up expectations in the customer's mind that you'll need to meet or even hopefully exceed. And it's a really good idea for everyone in your company to talk about what specific expectations will be in the customer's mind. And that way, well, your customer care system is going to run smoothly. Now, we talked about in this message some general things that we all need to do with our restoration customers, how to consistently create positive moments of truth, such as the need for speedy response. We want to get there fast, but we don't want to be so quick that we forget the essential equipment we're going to need or the tools that we're going to have to use to do the job. So in other words, get our ducks in a row. Otherwise, you're going to deliver a negative moment of truth to the customer. And then when things are screwed up, don't break down in front of the customer. Don't scream at the office in front of them. All that's going to do is give them bad vibes, and then they're going to really start to inspect the work we do. Remember the attitude that we want to convey. We want to project an attitude to our customer of competent calm. Yes, we want to be calm, efficient, professional, and caring. And these are wonderful feelings that you're going to convey silently to your customers by your appearance, your attitude, and your actions. Now, when we arrived at Mrs. Wilson's house, we got off to a good start before we ever knocked on her door. We parked in the street, and then later, if we needed to, we asked permission to move the truck closer to her house. We got out of the truck promptly. And think about this. Think about the message that we send to our customer if the office over the phone really conveys this sense of urgency. And then, of course, that's what Mrs. Wilson expects. And then when we get to her house, we all sit out in the van and leisurely finish a cigarette before we get out. You see, that's a really bad way to start. So we knocked on the door, and then what did we do? We took our sunglasses off. And then we stepped back so Mrs. Wilson wouldn't feel intimidated when she answers the door. Then we used our 5-step customer service system for an initial meeting, what we called our doorstep moments of truth. And there were 5 of them. Do you remember what they were? We stood tall. We looked Mrs. Wilson in the eye. We gave her a big smile. And then we introduced ourselves. And we introduced our co-workers. Now, the scenario I just described may not seem like that big of a deal to you, and maybe you're doing all these things already, and if you are, I think that's wonderful. But you know, it never hurts to have some customer service reminders. And frankly, to be honest with you, most restoration employees aren't doing these things. So if you just use the points we've already talked about, you're going to be ahead of 95% of your competitors. Mrs. Wilson is going to be getting warm, positive feelings about our company, and we haven't even walked through her door yet. But we want to do better. We want to just, forgive this expression, flood Mrs. Wilson with positive moments of truth. We want to continue to answer Mrs. Wilson's unspoken questions with our unspoken answers. And we'll talk about more customer service skills for fire and water damage restoration. Welcome back to Tracking Moments of Truth, Part 2. We're going to continue our moment-by-moment analysis of a typical restoration loss. And I'm also going to share with you some general customer service tips that I've picked up over the last 20 years. In our previous message, we began tracking moments of truth step by step through Ruth Wilson's property loss. And it's a typical residential water damage, just like the ones that you do every day. Mrs. Wilson has 3 inches of water throughout part of her home from a broken water line. But remember, we're not going to focus here on drying procedures or how to disinfect with chemicals. Instead, we're going to continue to examine moments of truth that Mrs. Wilson encounters as she deals with our company. As we've already learned, moments of truth are any point where your customer or a prospective customer comes into contact with your company and forms an opinion. There can literally be hundreds or even thousands of moments of truth in the customer's mind in a typical restoration job. Now, we discussed some of the ways that we can create or influence moments of truth. Let's review a few of them and get used to the little that follows each moment of truth. For example, we arrive on time for work. Now, of course, that creates a positive moment of truth in your boss's mind. But even more importantly, it gets your day started right, and it helps you keep the good attitude that you walked through the office door with. Now, you did come to work with a good attitude, didn't you? I sure hope so. Our appearance is good. We've got a clean uniform on. Our shoes are shined. And we have good personal hygiene, so we won't risk offending our customers during the day. Now, our office has preconditioned Mrs. Wilson by not only being warm, caring, and concerned, but also by calmly taking control of her situation. We loaded our equipment and we carefully checked it off against an equipment list that our office provided. And then we drove to Mrs. Wilson's house, and as we drove, we readjusted our attitude. We realized it wouldn't be productive to take out our frustrations on her for having to work late. After all, Mrs. Wilson, with 3 inches of water in her living room, has plenty of problems of her own. Now, as we neared Mrs. Wilson's home, we knew that we could start banking positive moments of truth even before we knocked on her door. So we parked the van out on the street. We got out of the van promptly. And we used the paved walk, not her lawn, to get to the front door. After knocking, we stepped back 3 feet, and we mentally reviewed our 5-step, doorstep moments of truth procedure. What were they? Number 1, we're going to stand tall. Number 2, look the customer in the eye. Number 3, we're going to give the customer a big smile. And then number 4, we're going to introduce ourselves with our full name, the name of our company, and why we're there. And then number 5, we'll introduce our co-workers, along with a brief overview of what their function is in the customer's home. Now, it's been well said that nothing sounds sweeter to an individual than the sound of their own name. So use your customer's name frequently when you're talking to them. However, with a last name like Toburin, I'm aware of the negative feelings, the negative moments of truth that occur in my mind when someone mangles and messes up the pronunciation of my name. So always make sure that you're pronouncing your customer's name correctly. How do you do that? Well, it's simple. Just ask them. That's right, you just ask the customer if you're pronouncing their name correctly. For example, notice the positive impact here. Mrs. Gallimore, my name is Steve Toburin from Sierra Cleaning. I'm here to inspect the smoke damage. Am I pronouncing your name correctly? Now see, you had at least 4 positive moments of truth there in 10 seconds. What a deal. So here we are. From the second that we came inside of Mrs. Wilson's home, we've built our actions around that old cliche, first impressions are lasting opinions. We've already created several dozen positive moments of truth. Mrs. Wilson's subconscious is saying,
Hey, maybe these people know what they're doing. Wouldn't that be a nice surprise?
So how do we continue to build on our customer service success? How do we keep on creating this stream of positive moments of truth? We keep on building these wonderful moments of truth by giving Mrs. Wilson the illusion of control. Now, this is an extremely important service engineering concept. And since you're there to heal the loss anyway, let me illustrate with a hypothetical example in the medical field. Let's say that you become very, very sick very, very suddenly. You suffer crushing chest pains, and you're rushed to the emergency room. Now, the staff there stabilizes your condition, and you're placed in intensive care, strapped in a bed with tubes inserted all over your entire body. You've never had any heart problems at all, so you don't even know a heart specialist. So a doctor totally new to you will have to be assigned to your case. Got the picture? It's not a very pretty one, is it? What emotions are you feeling right now? Well, I'm going to guess you're feeling emotions such as fear, bewilderment, frustration, shock, confusion, anger. Say, doesn't that sound just like the emotions that Mrs. Wilson is feeling with her flooded house? So keeping that key word control in mind, let's consider 3 different ways a surgeon could deal with you, your feelings and your emotions. The first way is where a strange doctor runs into your room, impatiently grunts at you, glares at your chart, and raps out, "I'm going to have to cut you open. We'll have to perform a triple quaternary double backsplash bypass laparotomy. I'll do it tomorrow morning, 6 a.m., no food or water for you till then." Then as he turns to walk out, he barks out, "Doesn't look good. You better get your affairs in order before tomorrow morning." Now that man has control. But how do you feel? You know, this guy might be the finest chest cutter in 6 states, but you're not going to want him operating on you. He's got too much control. Well, what about us? Could we wind up being the restoration equivalent of this autocratic, dictatorial surgeon? The guy's a jerk. Now, maybe you're thinking, no way would I treat my customers that way. But I say to you, think again. Remember the emotional dynamics that we're encountering when we walk into Mrs. Wilson's home. Now, not only is she scared, but she also feels out of control. Now, see, that water might only be 3 inches deep in her house, but emotionally, Mrs. Wilson is drowning. She's over her head. Now, if we come in like gangbusters, being Mr. Efficiency, taking charge and rapping out orders, we'll be creating a lot of negative moments of truth. And the result? Resentment, anger, and a power struggle with the homeowner. And in a power struggle with the homeowner, you know who's going to be the loser there. Now, the doctor that I just described, he gets a lot done, and he sees a lot of patients. He may very likely even be highly skilled in a technical sense. But what mental and emotional state are this doctor's patients in when he's finished with them? So don't ever let the need for efficiency be more important than working with the customer's emotions. In a very real sense, as we start any restoration loss, we need to put the customer and the customer's feelings first. But let's go back to this illustration of control in medicine. Same scenario, you're flat on your back in intensive care, all sorts of tubes poking into your body, and in walks the surgeon assigned to your case. He's dressed in Bermuda shorts and a t-shirt, but hey, you know doctors need time off too, so you're not too worried about his attire. And in contrast to the little dictator that we just talked about, this guy's very polite. In fact, he's almost too polite because he seems unsure of himself, a little lost. He says hello, and then he looks and looks and looks at your chart. And then a nurse walks by and he says, "What do you think's wrong with this poor fellow?" Well, see, you're not getting good vibes from this guy at all. Your first impression is that this physician is weak and indecisive. So he's not enough in control. But hey, you decide to give him the benefit of the doubt, and so you whisper, "What's my chances, Doc?" And he, in sort of an embarrassed way, stammers back, I'm not really sure what's wrong with you. What do you think the problem is? Well, that doesn't really inspire confidence in you, does it? So see, just like a very sick patient, your restoration client needs guidance, they need advice, they need help. What I call a firm hand at the tiller. Your customers have a strange, ambivalent, almost schizophrenic attitude toward their being in control of their water or fire damage. They sort of want to be in control, but they sort of don't want to be in control. You see, it's their home, just like it's your body as you lay in the hospital. You want to make your own medical decisions, don't you? but you don't really have the knowledge. You don't have the training to do so completely on your own. So what do you need? You need to know your options, and you'd appreciate some expert, impartial advice from your doctor. You need the illusion of control. So now let's look at one more patient-surgeon interaction. And this time, we're going to keep in mind the phrase, the illusion of control. Now, you're still in intensive care. You've still suffered a major heart attack. You're still scared to death, and your life is still out of control. But notice the positive moments of truth that your new doctor creates. He walks in dressed like a doctor. You know, the white lab coat and that silly stethoscope. Why, he looks like Marcus Welby, M.D. He looks you in the eye. He smiles at you. Your doctor introduces himself. He shakes your hand. And then he draws up a chair and sits poised with his clipboard. And he asks you a question. He says, "How are you feeling?" Wow, how do you feel? Well, physically, you might still feel terrible, but emotionally, you're subconsciously saying, "I feel good. I like and trust this guy." Now, as far as we know, this guy might not even know a scalpel from a tongue depressor, and yet you already feel like he's a good doctor. Now, why do you feel that way? Because of all the confident, unspoken answers that he sent you. Positive moments of truth. But now let's see how your doctor builds on that good first impression he's made with you by giving you the illusion of control. The first thing your doctor does is he skillfully interviews you. He listens patiently, and he's focused intently on what you're saying. And as you talk, he jots down notes on what you have to say. When you've finished, he asks if he can examine you. And after the examination, he calmly explains what your tests and his analysis have come up with. He then explains your various options for treatment, along with the benefits and the disadvantages of each one. Now, he might draw pictures or point out on your body what he's talking about. Your doctor then patiently answers your questions using terms that you understand. And most importantly, he displays a calm attitude of care and concern. Now, let me ask you something, the patient. After this wonderful, kind, concerned doctor is finished, what's the first question you ask him? You've got it. You say, "What do you think I should do, doctor?" Do you know why you asked him this question? Because he's given you the illusion of control. Because of his tact and sensitivity, you feel in control of your medical destiny. So you're delighted to bring him on board as your expert consultant. And that's the role that we want to play with our restoration customers, that of being an expert consultant. So give your customer the illusion of control. Believe me, the illusion of control is all your customer wants. Just like you with your doctor, they want the big picture and then the options available to them, and then they want to make a decision with your help and your advice. And then they want the job done. Now, after you've chosen your surgery option, you're not going to say to your doctor, "Oh, by the way, Doc, I've decided I want you to suture my left ventricle with 4/0 green silk. Not the pink silk. I want the green 4/0 double-strength thread. And while you're at it, doctor, I want you to tie off each stitch with the Flugenheimer knot." Now, you're not going to do that. That'd be ridiculous. You're going to let your chosen expert do the job you've hired him for. And why are you going to do that? because you have confidence in him. Now, in the same way, if your restoration client is continually micromanaging the job, if they're all the time hanging over your shoulder, then you probably haven't answered all of their unspoken questions. So always fix the customer and the customer's emotions first, and then fix the problem. Let's see how we can do this at Mrs. Wilson's. Standing on Mrs. Wilson's porch after you've completed your 5 doorstep moments of truth that we talked about on the previous tape, it's easy for an awkward pause to happen. You don't want to be pushy, so you wait for Mrs. Wilson to invite you in. Now, Mrs. Wilson, on the other hand, she's not an expert, and she doesn't have the slightest idea what her role is in this, so she waits for you. Well, it's now time to give Mrs. Wilson the illusion of control. Mrs. Wilson, would you please show us where the water came from and the rooms that it's affected? Aha, do you see what we're doing here? Mrs. Wilson feels in control. This is something she knows. She knows where that water came from. She feels useful. So she opens the door, and you prepare to follow her. But wait a minute here. Do you remember how we answer unspoken questions with unspoken answers? Well, here's one unspoken question every homeowner has as you step into their home.
Will they track dirt into my home?
Now, your unspoken answer to this is to very carefully, very obviously wipe your shoes. Now, for example, our restoration company used to carry our own doormats to every customer's door and unroll them and wipe our feet on our own doormats before we even stepped into the customer's home. Now, how's that for sending the customer a powerful, silent message? As you proceed through Mrs. Wilson's home, just like the caring doctor that we talked about, you're going to interview her and examine and test her problem. Incidentally, do you remember how our professional doctor had a stethoscope draped around his neck? Now, you know, doctors seldom use those anymore, but a stethoscope sure makes them look like a doctor. Well, now, you'd sure look silly using a stethoscope on flooded carpets, but there's a whole lot of other testing equipment that you should have with you. For example, always bring in a hydrosensor to check for hidden moisture in the pad. Now, you also want to have carpet tools to expose the carpet backing, hygrometers to measure the humidity, moisture meters to check for water in the insulation. You get the idea. Now, of course, fire damage restoration has a different set of tools, but the principles behind their use is the same. Now, it's true in both cases these tools are necessary much of the time, but even more important, these tools are stage props. And these stage props help you establish your professional credibility with Mrs. Wilson. But here's an important principle anytime you do any testing, or for that matter, anytime you do anything in your customer's home. Always, always ask permission. It gets back to that idea of giving the customer the illusion of control. You see, your doctor just doesn't reach out and grab you, unbutton your shirt without asking, and place his stethoscope on your chest without saying a word. You'd feel violated if he did that. No, instead, he tells you what he's going to do, and by doing so, receives your permission. So just how does this work in the customer's home? This idea of giving the customer the illusion of control by always asking permission. Now, like everything else we do in the customer's home, we look at it through the customer's eyes. Now, what's Mrs. Wilson think? She's already worried about her carpet. Several of her friends who are no doubt carpet experts have told her that once carpet gets wet, it's ruined forever. And now you're coming in and poking sharp steel points into her poor wounded carpet. Now, she hears that little popping noise as the points penetrate her carpet backing. Well, back in our bad old days in our business before we started focusing on the customer, we actually had customers tell the adjuster we'd ruined their carpet by poking holes in it. And let me tell you something, we couldn't change their mind, and adjusters don't appreciate being put in that position. Now let's contrast this bad way with a different scenario. You're standing at the source of the water, and Mrs. Wilson has told you everything about the loss, including what she fixed for dinner last night and the fact that she's been with this same insurance company for the last 26 years and she's never had a problem. And you patiently listen because you always listen. And then you say, Mrs. Wilson, what I'd like to do now, with your permission, is to test your carpet for subsurface moisture to see how far the water's spread. You see, water takes the path of least resistance, and it might be in your pad, and we wouldn't even know about it. Now, I use this special tool. It's a hydrosensor with these little sharp steel probes. Now, it's not going to hurt the carpet. It will penetrate right through, and it beeps every time we hit water. Now, is that all right with you? Now, you don't have to use these exact words, but do you get the idea? We've accomplished several things here. Number one, we have sent yet another silent answer to Mrs. Wilson's unspoken question.
Do these people know what they're doing?
Yes, Mrs. Wilson, we do. I've done this before. I even have my water-damaged stethoscope here, and I know how to use it. Now, number two, we've also taken control of this job, which is exactly what Mrs. Wilson wants you to do. But we've given her the illusion of control by asking her permission to test her carpet. And finally, we've looked at our procedures through our customer's eyes, and we've anticipated her mental reaction and solved it before Mrs. Wilson suffered through a negative moment of truth. So do you see the power of this approach of always building our actions and procedures around the mental comfort of our customer? Now, this concept might seem hard at first, but trust me on this, after a while, it becomes second nature. And the beautiful thing about this philosophy of always looking at ourselves through the customer's eyes is it translates to anything that we do in the customer's home. For example, if you need to move a chest of drawers, the correct procedure is to open the top drawer, and you slip your hand under the horizontal rail so you won't pull the top off when you lift up on it. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. It's a good technical procedure. But if Mrs. Wilson is watching you with your new awareness of the customer's viewpoint,